But basically, I'm here to tell you what you all know perfectly well. And if I asked you which country in the rich developed world has more obesity than you do, more violence, bigger prison populations, more teenage births, I don't know, more violence, you all know that the US does. And if I ask you which have less, and in the rich developed world, you know that the Scandinavian countries and Japan do better on all those kinds of things. And if also I ask you about, that intuition that people have had for hundreds of years, since the French Revolution or before, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. So many of us have that intuition. And basically, that's all the data says. The only thing I'm going to do is to show you how close that pattern of health and social problems internationally fits the amount of inequality in each society. I mean, basically, all it shows is that intuition is right. It's truer than I think, certainly than I ever imagined. It's profoundly true. But the point about this is I'm going to show you that one problem after another is more common in more unequal societies. Our book is sometimes called a theory of everything because we deal with drug problems and prison populations and, as I said, teenage birth rates and mental illness and, so people say it's a theory of everything. It's actually a theory of problems with social gradients. And, of course, you can look at social gradients, the tendency for all sorts of problems to be more common at the bottom of the social ladder. And you can imagine that maybe that's the problem people getting sorted out. Maybe the resilient move up and the vulnerable move down, and that's why all these things have social gradients. However perfectly you sorted the population out according to vulnerability or whatever, you wouldn't get 10 times as much of these problems in some societies as others. And most of what I'm going to show you, the problems are anything from twice as common to 10 times as common in societies with bigger income differences. And that's because it's not simply the poor who are affected by greater inequality. It's pretty well the whole population. And this, you see, is just national income in relation to life expectancy. And what you see is very rapid rises in the early stages of economic growth. Life expectancy improves fast, and then it sort of levels out. And the interesting thing is if you look at measures of happiness or well-being, you get pretty much the same shape. Rapid improvements early in economic growth and then gradually flattening out. I started off, actually, my first degree was economic history, and it seems inevitable that as societies get richer, maybe diminishing returns will set in somewhere at some time. Economic growth is really important when people haven't got basic necessities, but it's less and less important as we get more and more. More and more of everything makes less and less difference. And that's basically what this curve is. And life expectancy goes on increasing, but that's because that curve moves up over time, not because we move out along a given one. I'm going to be talking, though, just about rich countries up here on the flat part of the curve. So we just took the rich developed countries up there. And if I move to the next slide, that's just that little bit of the last graph blown up, so you can see it bigger. And you can see that some of these countries on the right, Norway and USA, are twice as rich as Israel, Greece and Portugal. And currencies are converted to reflect prices, so people in those countries can buy twice as much of everything as people in those countries. And it doesn't make any difference at all. And yet probably all of you know that health is worst in the poorest areas of our societies. Indeed, there are these social gradients in health which are, where Clyde's interests and my interests started off, trying to understand what drives these social gradients in health. I'm sorry this is data from England and Wales, but it really looks rather similar wherever you get it from. But you see on the right-hand side, this is all small areas classified by levels of deprivation. The most deprived areas on the right with low life expectancy, the least deprived areas with high life expectancy. It seems to me that those differences in life expectancy related to where you are in society looks to me like the greatest human rights abuse in modern societies. It's not a difference between the poor and the rest of society. All of us are part of this gradient. But it's a paradox that income or something seems very important within our societies, but it doesn't mean anything between the rich developed countries. And of course the answer, the explanation of that paradox is within societies we're dealing with social position, social status, where we are in relation to each other, the size of the differences between us. And all I'm going to do is to suggest what happens when you stretch out those differences or compress them a bit. I'm going to talk a lot about equality and inequality, and I'm never talking about anything hypothetical. I don't know perfectly equal societies, and fortunately I don't think we know perfect tyrannies either. But the measure of inequality we've used is just how much richer the richest 20% and the poorest 20% in each country. But anyway, on that measure, you see in the more equal countries, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the richest 20% is only 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the poorest 20%. Yet look at that end, and the gap's twice as big in countries like UK, Portugal, USA. But anyway, some societies, amongst the rich market democracies, which we all think are much of a muchness, are twice as unequal as others on that measure. Canada, you see, in the middle, but actually you've been moving rapidly in the wrong direction. Your income differences have really taken off recently, and I'm told you're getting more unequal faster than most other OECD countries. I said that this was really about problems that have social gradients, and it's a theory of problems with social gradients. And we're preoccupied with these things all the time. And, if I'd lived in the 19th century and somebody had said, had been able to forecast the modern standards of comfort and luxury across such a large proportion of the population, I'd think we would be in some kind of utopia. Instead of finding that in many countries mental illness is becoming increasingly common. And I don't know about here, but at home you see reports of the levels of self-harm amongst teenage girls and things like that. I mean, it's simply an appalling scale of problems. And everyone worrying about drugs and violence and antisocial behaviour and so on. The middle one is prison overcrowding. Our prisons got fuller than they've ever been about a year ago. Anyway, we collected internationally comparable data on as many of these kinds of problems as we could. We collected data on life expectancy for each country, maths and literacy scores of young people, infant mortality, homicide rates, imprisonment, that's simply the proportion of the population in prison in each country, and teenage birth rates, levels of trust, which is simply how much people feel they can trust others in society, obesity rates, mental illness, which in these WHO figures include drug and alcohol addiction, and some figures on social mobility that allow us to compare, social mobility in different countries. Here we've put them all together in a sort of ragbag index of health and social problems. And they're all weighted equally. So where a country is just its average position on these things, affected just as much by obesity as homicides or any of the others. And here you see how well or badly countries do in relation to the measure of inequality I've just shown you. It's really an astonishingly close relationship. But if you look at that same index here in relation to national income per person, there's no relationship. We decided to look at the unit index of child well-being. It's a measure of child well-being put together to measure child well-being in rich countries. It has 40 different components. So, whether kids can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying at school, whether kids have books at home, what immunization rates are like, all that goes into it. One of the measures that goes into it actually is the proportion of kids in each country in relative poverty. That's very like a measure of inequality, so we took that out so people wouldn't say this is a circular argument. And here is that UNICEF index of child well-being. But again, look at this index of child well-being in relation to national income per person, and there's no relationship. So countries can be twice as rich as others, and it doesn't help children one little bit. You know, I get quite impatient with the children's charities at home that go on talking about child poverty without differentiating between relative and absolute poverty. And that makes it uncontroversial politically. So people on one side of the political divide can think, what we need is more economic growth, more incentives to industry, reduce corporation tax, and children will benefit. That's just not true. It's a matter of how far behind the rest of us children are and how unequal a society they're growing up in is. I'm going to show you now some of the separate components of our index. I could show you many more than I have time to, but this one is trust, simply the proportion of the population who feel that most people can be trusted. And I don't know what people here say, but you see, in the more countries, like Portugal and Singapore, it's only about 15% of the population who feel they can trust others. But at the more equal end, it's 60 or 65%. If I showed you measures of involvement in community life or social capital, very similar relationships. And so, you know, I think that's an important confirmation of the truth of the intuition that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. It actually damages the quality of social relations in a society. I may say we did all this work twice. We did it on the rich developed countries, and then we repeated it on the 50 American states, asking just the same question. We were looking to see whether the American states with bigger income differences did worse on all these sort of health and social problems. The picture is remarkably similar. Almost everything that is significantly related to inequality internationally is also related to inequality amongst the American states.